Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Vistas and Voices, where we explore compelling conversations with experts and enthusiasts passionate about conservation, sustainability, and the natural world. I'm your host, Tyler Garwood. Today's episode blends science, ethics, and heartfelt dedication to the natural world. My guest today is Chelsea Greer, the Wolf Conservation Manager at Raincoast Conservation Foundation. Chelsea is dedicated to safeguarding the lands, waters, and wildlife of coastal British Columbia through scientific research, public education, and wildlife management reform. In this episode, we discuss the complex world of wolf management, political challenges, and the ecological significance of wolves. We dive into the historical persecution of wolves, controversial wolf culling programs, and the critical need for habitat protection. Chelsea shares her journey and why she's pursued a career with wild animals, the ethical considerations in wildlife management, and the importance of integrating Indigenous knowledge and practices into conservation efforts. We had a genuinely fantastic conversation that could have gone on much longer. Chelsea will be back for another episode in the future. As always, thank you for tuning into Vistas and Voices, and enjoy the show. All right, and we are recording. Chelsea, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day, and I'm glad we were able to make this work out. And I'm really excited for our conversation today. I think that wolf conservation is important and interesting no matter where you're at. And then when it comes to wolf conservation in BC, it gets a little more interesting with the politics that get involved in the industry. And it becomes, a triage or just a cascading of complications within wolf conservation. So I'm glad you're able to take the time today and talk about that and help me learn some more about what there is to learn. So
yeah,
go ahead.
I'm excited. No, I just want to say thank you for having me, and I'm excited to be here and talk about all these issues. There's a lot to talk about. Lots of maybe not positive, but harder things to talk about. And then obviously, like, we can balance that with some positive things about wolves, because there are a lot of positive things about wolves and wolf conservation.
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't want to put an episode out there that's going to make anyone cry or sad. So I'd love to include the positive notes in there, help balance that out. Would you care to give us some backgrounds? Like how did you get to where you're at? What do you do? And just a little background.
Yeah, I mean, I can give you a bit of a background on how I got here. I've always really had an immense love and compassion towards animals, but it was a little bit of a, I guess, unpaved road for me to get here. Interestingly enough, when I look back, like, I was drawn towards animals by like what I'd seen on TV and these like really personal relationships that some people had with animals, especially like, as for example, like zookeepers and the relationships that they had with captive animals. And that was something that like drew me to it. And I think it was my second year biology class in my undergrad. I was talking to my bio teacher about like what I could do. And she was like, okay, if you want to work with captive animals, then you should look into this program at UBC, that is the University of British Columbia, the Land and Food Systems Department. They have this applied animal biology program, and it focuses on like animal behavior and physiology, but also the role of ethics around animals in society. So there's a really big emphasis on animal welfare. So I went into that program and very quickly learned that I do not want to be supporting animals in captivity. I learned, a lot about animal welfare and the reality for many of these animals, and really just how the best way to serve and care for these animals is to not have a personal bond, give them their space and the respect that they deserve, and, really put efforts in towards studying and understanding them, but also protecting their habitats. So I kind of quickly switched to this idea of, which, I mean, brings me to Raincoast too, or brought me to Raincoast, is this kind of link between animal welfare science and conservation biology. So I always knew I wanted to work with wild animals, and, emerging fields have kind of come out that marry the two, where, really recognizing that animal welfare is a huge component within wildlife conservation. Like, we need welfare is directly linked to just even the quality of habitat that these animals face or have or don't have. And so essentially I had an opportunity that arose after my undergrad, which led me quite far away from BC and far away from wolves. But I studied Asian elephants in Thailand, kind of taking that approach of animal welfare and conservation biology. And then during my master's work, I actually worked under a coyote and wolf expert who had worked really closely with Dr. Paul Paquette, who is Raincoast senior scientist and my current mentor. And I was looking for an internship. I learned about Raincoast and I was like, there's no other organization that I want to work for. It literally focuses on, my backyard and just really things that I value. And so I think I sent them like 80 emails until I got through and got an internship with Raincoast. And then I started kind of as an initial coordinator for our wolf conservation program. And that position kind of grew. I direct the program now. And we kind of have this component of, we essentially use scientific research, public education, and wildlife management reform to kind of better move forward our conservation objectives to protect and preserve wolves in BC.
It sounds like an amazing job to be in your backyard and be involved with the wildlife in your backyard in such a intimate way, being able to study them and get paid for it, right? It seems like a lot of people might want to do that on the weekend. So your work at Raincoast, you mentioned that you're the wolf conservation manager now. Is that right?
Yeah, so we have various programs, and one of our programs, we focus a lot on, and kind of give you a little bit of a background of who Raincoast is that will lead into explaining where the wolf conservation program fits in. But essentially, we're a nonprofit organization, and we're made up of a team of scientists and conservationists who are dedicated to safeguarding the lands, waters, and wildlife of coastal British Columbia. Most of our work, or all of our work, kind of centers around partnerships with other scientists, First Nations, local communities, and other NGOs. And we're working towards building support for decisions that protect these ecosystems, whether it's marine ecosystems or terrestrial ecosystems. And then much of our work focuses on, and this is a huge part of our vision, foundational species like salmon, and then umbrella species like whales or cetaceans, and large carnivores like bears and wolves. So that's kind of where the wolf program fits in. We focus more broadly on large carnivores. We've done a lot of work on grizzly bears, and this program specifically focuses on wolves, but a lot of our work kind of focuses on the importance of large carnivores more broadly.
It sounds like a very amazing thing to do in BC, especially being as far south as you are and getting to interact with grizzly bears. Just across the border in the States, there are no grizzly bears. So you have, that special slice right where you're at. There
is talk about reintroducing grizzly bears into just below the border in the Northern Cascades. So you might have them soon.
Yeah, I heard about that. It's very exciting. I obviously another controversial subject, but I give it the go ahead personally.
Me too.
I would like to talk to you about the management of wolves in BC and what you work on. And so your work, does it kind of put the spotlight on the practices done by the province and really scrutinize those and make sure that they're in line with the best available science, best available practices?
Yeah, that's one main goal, I think, is to really point out and kind of deconstruct many of the assertions that are made by the province in terms of like how wildlife, and more specifically large carnivores and wolves, are managed. I mean, Raincoast, like, our goals are conservation and ecological management, which is very different than traditional wildlife management that the province does. And if you look at, so it was 10 years ago that the BC Wolf Management Plan was created, and it's very heavily, and there's a huge emphasis on lethal management. So that includes population control through recreational hunting and trapping, commercial trapping, government-sanctioned wolf kill programs for caribou recovery and livestock protection. And so there's kind of this emphasis on, kind of there's a lot of what isn't conservation, like they kind of work under the guise of conservation, I would say. And instead of kind of promoting wolves to kind of persist in living their wild ways under all these conditions and threats that they face, it's more kind of managing them where we can sustain them at like the most minimum numbers where they can still carry out their ecological function, but killing them at the maximum number. So that's kind of reflected in a lot of hunting and trapping regulations. So in BC, essentially, all you need is a hunting license, which is different from a lot of big game species where you need a hunting license and a specific species tag, which costs, upwards of hundreds of dollars. With wolves are the only like designated big game species that doesn't require a tag. There's a lot of problems with that. One being we have no idea how many people are interested in killing wolves and purchasing tags and going out there. It's done often very opportunistically. And, there's an open season on wolves in many areas. The province is kind of divided between 8 or 9 regions, and there's different management units among those. And there's very few regions where there's no open season on wolves. And in most cases, it's 9 to 10 months that you're allowed to kill up to 3 wolves in some regions, but then there's no bag limits in others. And that's to essentially encourage people to kill more wolves in these areas that there's concerns for caribou and there's concerns for livestock. So there's some issues within that as well. And yeah, it's a lot of this is based on anecdotal evidence, not very much science-based. There's not confident numbers in wolf populations as well. And that aside, even if we did have a good idea, a confident level or a confident idea of how many wolves there are, there's so much more to consider than just the population level. Like we need to look at the individuals, the pack level, all of these things influence. Oh, sorry, my Apple Watch was just responding to me. But yeah, there's just between all these activities, there's just so many wolves that are killed every year. And the thing is, there's a lot of wolves killed, but in reality, we really don't know how many wolves are killed. So we don't know how many wolves there are. And we also don't know how many are being killed. There's through these like government sanctioned wolf cull programs, there's a little bit more confidence in the numbers. But then we look at hunting and trapping, the way that they estimate how many numbers of wolves are being killed is through these hunter surveys where they survey like 20% of the hunter population and ask them kind of, how many days do they spend hunting wolves? How many wolves did they kill? And the thing is, like, hunters that hunt large carnivores are kind of on the fringe minority of that community. And so there's a lot of unreliability that comes from those surveys, not just based on that, but just even the government admits that in the management plan. Like there's a lot of uncertainty through estimating how many wolves are being killed through those survey methods. And then on top of that, knowing like how there's just this small population that hunts large carnivores, but they can kill a lot of carnivores. And that can lead into other things too, of issues of like predator killing contests. But there's a lot of, communities and events that can be organized where the main focus is to kill as many predators as possible under the idea that that's going to bolster huntable ungulate species. So yeah, we don't really know exactly how many wolves are being killed, but just by those estimates, just from recreational hunting alone, anywhere from 750 to 1,100 annually. And then you have commercial trapping, recreational trapping, you have control programs. So yeah, that's kind of a lot of what we're trying to kind of get out to the public so that the public understands what the government is doing and really trying to promote wolf conservation at the same time of like really emphasizing like in a lot of these plans, like beyond their intrinsic value as a living being, like wolves are extremely important to ecosystems, and a lot of that is lost in a lot of these management plans.
Yeah. And what's going through my head right now is, well, I I feel that most species are managed to a population level where they're sustainable for hunting purposes, such as deer and elk. The number is, they'll restrict the number of tags provided in order to balance that with the populations. Whereas I'm not really hearing that on the wolf side. And also, what factors came into play where wolves had to be managed so heavily from the province, not just hunting itself?
Yeah, I mean, that goes way back. There's a long history of persecution of wolves, which is really important to consider in this conversation. So, back when colonization started, what was also brought over was agriculture. And with agriculture came the idea of bounties, because you bring over a species like livestock that are an easy target for wolves, and you're moving into these habitats that wolves are in. Of course, there's likely going to be conflict. And so that brought over this idea of bounties. There's a long history of bounties where there's just these incentivized reasons to kill, and money's provided, prizes are provided. And so we've been persecuting wolves for centuries, essentially. And it, to the point that, I mean, on Vancouver Island between the 1950s and 70s, wolves were essentially considered extirpated from the island. And that has huge impacts on genetics. Raincoast did some work on that as well, of like, finding even genetics from domestic dogs within these wolves, because it's like how these wolves then have to repopulate, and what species they're interacting with. Like, it can really affect their genetics and their genetic strength to persist as like these wolves that they once were. And that's another thing too, is through all this persecution that didn't just happen on Vancouver Island, it happened province wide. It really, like, we don't have the same wolves that we once did. And that is a huge impact on conservation as well. And we're kind of learning that. And a lot of what we know about wolves is from studying wolves in disturbed systems. There's very few undisturbed systems that we can learn from. So yeah, I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, somewhat. I mean, the historical version of it, yeah. And
Yeah. So yeah, I guess, sorry, leading into kind of why we have to manage, or why we are managing wolves. I think it's been within this Western culture for so long. And this idea that wolves need to be managed has somehow, it's really pervasive within our culture and misinformed in a lot of ways.
is it misinformed due to a lack of science? Or what leaves this controversial topic being so uninformed to this day?
I mean, I think that like predators and wolves specifically really stir up a lot of emotions for people. And it, whether or not science based or not, like, people have really strong feelings about wolves who are competitors for the sake, go after the same species that a lot of us want to also go after. So they're a direct competitor in terms of those species that we want to hunt and eat for ourselves. And that's created has really perpetuated these negative perceptions of wolves and having to manage them. And in reality, I mean, especially when we have a lot of these populations that have, like, elk and deer populations that are getting pressure from hunters and from wolves, that can have a huge impact on their populations as well. And I mean, I think the underlying reason that we're really when we're seeing the prey populations that a lot of folks are concerned about diminish, the underlying reason for that is habitat destruction. And so a lot of these, like, main issues that are being driven by habitat loss through industries like logging and mining, oil and gas and all of that, they're being destroyed, and wolves are just often the default, the scapegoat that are always blamed for these issues. And so just from the long history of persecution, that has kind of been kind of the default. And it also allows the government to kind of be like, this is what we're doing in the short term. Meanwhile, in the background, industrial logging is still taking place. So it's kind of just, a tactic to be like, this is what we're doing. Perhaps we're seeing numbers grow, perhaps not, but like logging is still happening. And that's the main issue. And that's why I think a lot of this still happens, is because we're seeing a lot of populations, specifically ungulate populations, struggle in a lot of areas. And wolves are just kind of used as the scapegoat there. Because like destroying habitat can also, it changes wolf behavior as well. It can provide more access to certain ungulate species. It just changes a lot of movement. So in some cases, wolves might be preying more heavily on these species and might have an impact on their success, but the underlying issue is habitat destruction. And that's really what we need to address.
Yeah, particularly old growth, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. I was reading the paper that was just released from Clayton Lamb, and it was released less than a month ago. So I feel like this is hot off the press in a way. I don't think I've ever discussed or read a scientific article that was so recently published. And from that, I learned that the changes in habitat, so like when you remove the old growth and it's replaced, the forage within there, the relationship between the forage and the prey and the predator was really cool, because when you remove the old growth, what is, I guess, the first growth, once again, attracts moose and deer, which then attracts wolves. And then there's maybe some residual caribou nearby, which kind of brings caribou into closer proximity with wolves, which is then the relationship. Is that, did I understand that correctly?
Yeah. So caribou, just to preface this, to really heavily rely on old growth forests, not only for protection from predators, but also a main food source. Like lichens are really important to their diet. And then when you have industry come in, create these seismic lines, these roads, also recreation can have a big impact, creating pathways through snowmobiling and all of that. It creates this easier access. Wolves are just known to, if you give them an easier path of travel, they're going to exploit it. So depending on how heavily, if there's a heavy presence of humans, that can impact how much they use that, but they will generally exploit those roads and those easier ways to travel. So that's kind of the issue. And then you have, like you said, when these new like clear cuts happen and you have new growth within those areas that attract deer and moose, and then also attract wolves. So that's kind of the idea behind 1 out of 2 of the lethal approaches to caribou recovery, which I can kind of, if you want, go through like the recovery actions that have been implemented. I don't know if we want to go through any like background before diving in to this paper. That might be important, but I guess what we kind of discussed before in previous conversations, I kind of do just want to like preface this
Absolutely.
whole conversation.
Go for it.
Yeah, just like it's obviously a complex and controversial topic, to say the least. But this is something that my mentor and senior scientist at Raincoast Conservation always emphasizes, is that science does not give us the permission to do anything. Science tells us what we can do, but deciding what we ought to do is a question of ethics and morality. And when we talk about, there's a lot of the ethical considerations of animal culling do not begin and end with scientific justification. So even if there is, like as I mentioned in our previous discussion, it's not necessarily super surprising that when you completely remove, like the goal of a lot of these areas when they're removing wolves is to remove up to 80% of the wolf population in that area. So that's, getting it down to, I think, 3 wolves per 1,000 square kilometers. And there's a strong relationship between predator and prey. And so when you're removing all of those predators, and then you're also in some cases penning the caribou, so protecting them in fences, kind of like caribou zoo, some would say, and then also providing supplemental feeding. It's not surprising that you would see kind of an increase in numbers with all of that support. So as to say, as we kind of proceed with this conversation, like ethics is a really important part of this, and it's often really lost in wildlife management, but science and ethics have this intrinsic link, and I think that's important to acknowledge.
Mhm. Yeah, it's such a complicated issue. As old growth in itself is a complicated issue. And then when you involve in the near extinction of a species, it becomes more so complicated. And then when you involve the killing of a species that preys on the near extinction species, it's also very complicated. And it's gone on for how long? You said the wolf cull program is 10 years at this point?
It was implemented in 2015, but I mean,
Okay.
important to note also that the government has been killing and sterilizing wolves for decades before that. That was just kind of the start of this official program. And caribou, I mean, yeah, they're listed as threatened. It's interesting, like there have also been papers that have come out recently that have kind of looked at the landscape of disturbance and logging within caribou habitat ever since also the Species at Risk Act was implemented in 2004. And I mean, some of the most threatened herds experience the highest rates of disturbance. So I think that's important to note. But yeah, just as a background too, it's, woodland caribou is the species, and then there's several ecotypes, but the southern mountain caribou ecotype is kind of a lot of the focus on this paper. And yeah, it's kind of, I mean, some positives, I guess, in the sense that like several of the recovery actions that they do mention are a positive would be that some of them are non-lethal, right? Like there's maternal penning, there's supplemental feeding. But the combination of those is what they saw kind of the most success in, and some of those being lethal, and not just with wolves, but they're also, as we mentioned, having that idea that like moose and deer are drawing wolves in. They're also implementing lethal management of moose. So it involves killing moose and killing wolves and cougars at a smaller scale. But wolves are the main focus. And yeah, I think like with Raincoast, there's generally like this idea of ambiguous support for something like this. Like we see this paper, it has a larger data set, no obvious analytical errors. But when we say ambiguous support for something like this, like there's been people studying this for years, and there's a lot of like just within the scientific community, not necessarily saying if one is right or wrong. There's just a lot of pushback on both sides of how effective these methods are. And some methods might work in one area, but might not work in others. This is a much larger data set covering a much larger span of time and space. And so there is kind of that support in terms of saying that killing wolves works, but we can't ignore kind of the ethical issue. And, the potential benefits to caribou recovery are uncertain. Well, when we consider the harm inflicted in the situation, that is certain. So the killing of wolves and the assured disturbance of the entire ecosystem, we know that is a certain thing. And when I say like the potential benefits to caribou recovery are uncertain, what this paper is showing is an increase in numbers, but we have to think long term. And everyone from all sides can agree that caribou need habitat. So habitat and critical caribou habitat needs to be protected. And then we need to be restoring that habitat as well. And there's also a lot of agreement with how long habitat restoration will take. And when we're looking at like what caribou need is old growth forests. Old growth forest takes a long time to grow. Like we're talking like hundreds of years. In some cases, when we're looking at forests that will provide refuge from predators and kind of mitigate those easy pathways of travel for wolves, lowering wolf density naturally, and then also creating those like boreal lichens that caribou need. It's in reality going to take a really long time. And in the best case scenario, if all logging in critical caribou habitat is halted today and restoration work is taken on at a large scale, which will require a lot of money as well and a lot of effort and capacity. One thing we also need to talk about is climate change. So if everything works in our favor and logging is halted and restoration work moves forward, we don't know in that time span, in 100, 200 years, like what this habitat is going to look like because of the impacts of climate change. Like, will it even favor caribou? So there's just all of these questions around that. And there's kind of this focus on this effort that is, in part misguided and ill-informed. And we really need to be putting the blame where it's due. And I think one of the risks with a paper like this is the lack of consideration of ethics in these recommendations. And this can one of the worries is that this, like seeing these short-term effects these short-term options being effective, like, is this going to give license to government to allow logging to continue? Like, these are some really hard political and economic decisions that have to be made. And if there's this paper that's kind of saying like, oh, these are all these short-term mitigation strategies that will work, like, that's the real worry there. Like, is this going to be, and that's where ethics comes into play. We have to think about like the impacts of what our results are going to have on these decisions. And it's decisions to kill wolves and also decisions to potentially not protect caribou habitat, which needs to be done now.
The protection, this reminds me of a similar scenario without wolves in the West Coast and the Cascades in the coastal range of the spotted owl. And so when the spotted owl was listed, there was a cease of logging of their habitat. But it seems that although the mountain caribou is listed, there's still a continuation of the extraction of their habitat. Is that not written into the provincial law anywhere or within the act that the habitat is it endangered or listed?
Yeah, they're listed as, they're listed, I think, generally as threatened. I don't know if it's changed over time. Like under SARA, I've seen the Southern mountain caribou group being listed as endangered. Obviously, there's differences in specific herds as well. Many of them are functionally extirpated. But yeah, generally threatened or endangered. And yeah, you would think that there has been a lot of push from a lot of organizations to enact certain legislation to kind of force the protection of these habitats. And that's kind of something that we continue to explore, how we can get that to actually happen. I mean, there have been some cases, and you might have seen that in this article, of examples where Indigenous governments, provincial and federal governments, have worked together to put in protections for certain areas. Like, I think this was 8,000 square kilometers of habitat to be protected. But that's on a smaller scale, and obviously it needs to be scaled up to have any impact as well. But it's also kind of, we need to be looking at the underlying issue and protecting habitat. But then there's also this part of the story that I think we still also need to be addressing and maybe start talking about, is this idea that with all of those considerations, I mean, caribou are on a slide to extinction, and it needs to be a discussion about, what they're actually facing and the reality. Like, unless they can adapt to a changing environment, which I think we're seeing that they can't in some cases. It's just a really sad reality, like what we've done in the past. And like, can we really get to a point where the habitat can support them? Because in reality, we cannot get the habitat back to what it once was, given like the large scale efforts and climate change specifically. Like yeah. So it's a sad reality, but I think it's something that needs to be talked about. Yeah.
I think this is one of the reasons why this is so controversial, because there's so many stakeholders involved. People who like wolves, people who don't like wolves, people who enjoy log or make a living with logging, they don't make a living with logging. There's so many stakeholders that like I've said before, the complexity of it is through the roof. And ideally, it would be nice for us as humans to kind of reflect on, what actions we're taking that could support it beyond taking the lives of other creatures, right? Because the prior to our existence colonizing BC, I'm sure that there was not a wolf cull program, and wolves and caribou lived somewhat of a balanced or cyclical system. And so when we came along, what actions did we take that required us to make this change in management? And if it boils down to it, it's the way in which we extract. It's our extraction industry. And we should maybe take a step back of focusing on the species A versus species B and really consider the time when those two populations were sustainable and what changed from that point. And then, fortunately, I believe, I guess not, maybe unfortunately, but I believe that we would be looking in the mirror and saying that like we are the issue. So, and we don't like change. And that just makes it all the more complicated, especially when industry and money is involved. So, but I'm glad that you're doing the work that you're doing, and that I think conservation is at a higher point than ever within the public, and that there's lots of money to be had, and we are recognizing there's a shift that I'm seeing just like within my lifetime, but also reflecting on, books and everything that were written in the 70s and 80s, that environmental movement is slowly gaining traction, and there's more and more environmentalists and people who are concerned about the environment and the well-being of other species. And so I hope that there's some very bright minds out there, such as yourself, that are going to help solve the issue or come to the best possible case for everyone involved, come to some sort of compromise, and really, just be the best news. And what you said at the beginning that we would not end any sad note or anything like that, and you said you had some joyful things to discuss. So, like, what's on your mind?
Yeah, I find, so I'm involved in like leading some research projects on the South Coast. So there's always a lot of positives that come from doing that work. A lot of that is documenting the return of wolves to some regions and working with partners that, just to kind of respond to some of the stuff that you were just saying too, I think like there's a clash of worldviews often. And I think like trying to shift to this worldview that values animals and respects like their intrinsic value. And also like the respect is a huge thing. And that's a huge part of many Indigenous cultures. And I think shifting like, and now like, meaningfully partnering with Indigenous governments and communities, I think is a huge important step towards that. And in many cultures, wolves and other species are relatives or family members. They're not species. They're not a resource that can be extracted or harvested, which is like a term that is commonly used in management wildlife as a euphemism for killing. Like it's just, there's all these terms that are used to kind of soften what's actually happening. And I think like that's a huge positive in the direction that we're headed. And So just in terms of I don't know if there's anything that you want me to specifically talk about, but that kind of segues into like, partnering with communities to do meaningful research and kind of documenting the return and the positives of having wolves on the landscape. But I can tell you a little bit more about the research that we do if that's something that you want to discuss.
I would like to mention that in my last podcast, I talked about natural resources and how I think it's a dirty word because I'm referring to the forest or, the biology of the world. And yet I'm saying that it's a resource, and it's not. I think that's a very antiquated term. And so I just wanted to, that's a thing that I'd like to work on, is not referring to it as natural resources, but more so the biology or the natural world. Do you have a term that you like to use?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, well, it depends what we're talking about. Like if we're talking, I would never refer to an animal. Well, a lot of the work that we do, like we try not to even use the word cull. Like cull is also euphemism, and euthanize is often used in these terms of like, oh, we're going out and controlling for populations and killing these wolves that have not even impacted anything like livestock or anything. They're just in their natural environment and we're euthanizing them. That doesn't fit within the actual definition of euthanize. And also, I guess, even just like the pronoun use of like when we're referring, there's definitely a shift that is happening, I think, in academic writing. I think it's really, really hard to break through, but not referring to animals as like they're living beings, like reframing sentences so that we're not even using the pronouns to avoid saying it, or, if the sex of the animal, like call the animal a she or a him. Like it just kind of diminishes the value of animals when we use all of these terms. So generally not trying to lump in animal, trees, like as resources, like it's shifting the language to, like really emphasizing the intrinsic value that all of these things hold and not just the value that they hold for humans. But then we also have to recognize that we live in a world that like those things, like even talking about the ecological value that animals have, that's an impact on humans as well. Like it's hard not to, like when you're trying to really reshape and rehabilitate the image of these animals, we still need to think about what will draw people in. So even talking about the economic value that like keeping these animals on the landscape will bring has some power in it, unfortunately, because that's the world that we live in.
Yeah. No, it's difficult. I mean, it starts with language, right? And I mean, even today, there's shifts in how we use language to refer to all sorts of things where it's been traditionally just not thought about. But then when you really think about it, there are implications to the language we use, even if we don't, it's not the intention we have, but it's how it impacts, and it kind of shapes our perception. You also mentioned working with Indigenous communities. How has that been? Like, have you had like profound learning experiences? How do they affect the way in which you do your job?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, with any of our research, like before one of the projects that I lead, like, we had intel that there was wolves in the area. So our first step is always to kind of approach the nation, whose territory we might potentially be working in, and not just saying, oh, we're going to work here. It's, can we work here and get permission? And is this something of interest to your community? And can we work together? I think really like working together authentically. And so the communities that we work with have been phenomenal to work with. And I find like I get so much joy from just learning on the land and also working alongside a lot of community members as well and learning different approaches. And I think it's so important because even as kind of a side, Raincoast is very much like we try and use non-invasive research methods. And one of that being like, because often a way to study wolves, for example, would be to collar them. And I always think about how the detachment you can get from, say, like just placing a collar on an animal and just studying them from afar versus when you're on the ground employing all these non-lethal methods through camera trappings, collecting genetic samples, then also being on the land with those that know it so well and know its ecological and cultural history is so important. And there's so much you can learn from wolves and their history by learning about the stories that have been told about them and what's being passed down from generation to generation. And just, I think a lot of my values align with the values that the communities hold, but there's so much to learn about like how to talk about these animals in a different way and how to approach the work and trying to fit in like how, like really learning about cultural protocols is really important as well, and how we can be culturally sensitive when we're on the land. And I think that's a huge and important step towards reconciliation and supporting Indigenous-led projects as well.
That's awesome. I'm really glad you're getting to do that and that is being done. I love learning about it because I've never learned about it coming from my background in the States. It wasn't really mentioned. And in Canada, it seems so in your face and prominent that it's very fascinating for me to learn about. And it's fantastic in general. So we're coming up.
And what
go ahead.
Oh yeah, we're coming up on time.
We are.
Well, I was going to say, because one of the podcasts that I listened to that you did talked about the two-eyed seeing approach. And that's something that Raincoast has always, really integrated into our work. And that's, kind of the approach that we take in our research and everything that we do in these partnerships. So lots to learn from that approach. And I think that's, the future.
Yeah,
for sure.
And that was with Andy Albert.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, she's wonderful. I'm glad you got to listen to that.
Yeah. Yeah, really great.
Okay, so coming into the end of the show, I have some questions that I would like to ask you that I ask everyone. And I think they just help provide some great notes to end on. And if people want to learn more, they're able to do so. So is there anything I should have asked you but didn't?
Oh, that's a good question. There's so many things that you could have asked me that we could have talked about. I think we could talk about wolves and wolf conservation for hours and hours. I think we covered a lot of important topics, though.
Okay.
So I'm going to say a soft no to that question.
Okay. Well, maybe we can do another podcast sometime. We can talk about all the other wolf questions.
Yeah. Oh, I guess like genetic, like the research side of things, genetics. That's one of the things that I am like really interested in, like the research aspect of things. I don't know if we have time to dive into it at all, but that's the one thing that came to my mind all of a sudden.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll plan it next time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's do that.
All right. What does a successful future look like to you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think based on a lot of what we talked about, I think successful being a place where wildlife are not just viewed as numbers, but respected as individuals and the intrinsic value that they hold. And then what we were just talking about, I think a future that supports two-eyed seeing for science and traditional knowledge are integrated into policy. And there's a focus on conservation and ecological management for the benefit of wildlife versus traditional management of wildlife. And then, to get there, just a world that truly supports Indigenous capacity and initiatives that are truly Indigenous led.
Okay. I love that answer. What makes you hopeful?
Yeah, that's also a good question. I feel like an important question for someone working in conservation. I'd say like the people that I work with. I'm inspired every day by the colleagues that I work with at Raincoast. Everyone is so driven and really passionate about what they do. And then, of course, I have a lot of gratitude to give to the First Nation governments and communities that I work alongside, and just for them allowing us to work on be part of the important work that they're leading on their territories. And then with the research side of things, I kind of touched on this, like we, of course, learn so much from the data that we collect from cameras, genetics, and so on, but just like from what we learn on the land and then working alongside Indigenous leaders is so invaluable. And I think being part of these, like being able to be part of these like really important initiatives make me really, really hopeful. Like when I get to go into communities and provide updates and just like learn on the ground, it really lights a fire under my ass and gets me really excited and hopeful for the future.
It's amazing. Well, I hope you keep doing it. Keep sharing.
Yeah, I hope so too.
And last but not least, Chelsea, are there any resources that you'd like to share where people can learn more about any of the topics that we've covered today?
Yeah, I'd say just generally Raincoast website, which is raincoast.org. If you want to learn more about wolves specifically, just add a /wolves to that. We have so many important programs that don't just focus on wolves, other large carnivores like the grizzly bear, cougars, forest conservation, healthy waters, wild salmon, cetaceans like the southern resident killer whales. There's a lot of important resources on our website that you can learn more, and follow us on social media at Raincoast as well. Yeah. And of course, we can add a contact for me if people want to reach out and have any questions as well. You can follow me on, I have such a hard time calling it X, but Twitter.
Okay.
At Chelsea Greer.
Okay. I'll put links to those in the show notes so people are able to find that.
Okay. Awesome.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been wonderful. I think there's so much more I want to know. So maybe, I think we should have another discussion sometime.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for inviting me on your podcast. I really enjoyed our discussion today.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Chelsea. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you for learning with me today and dedicating your time listening to Vistas and Voices. Time is our most valuable asset, and I'm grateful that you chose to share some of yours with me today. If today's episode struck a chord with you, I'd be honored if you could share it with friends, family, or colleagues who you think would enjoy it too. Every share, particularly those made through personal recommendations, plays a significant role in nurturing our growing community. If you could take a moment to leave a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you tune in, it would be immensely supportive. Your feedback is precious to me. It not only aids in enhancing our content, but it also helps others find our conversations. Please feel free to reach out to me via my website, www.thepursuitproject.org/contact, on Instagram @Tyler_Garwood, or on LinkedIn. Your thoughts, questions, and feedback are always greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to our next episode, where I'll see you right here on Vistas and Voices.